It is my incredible pleasure to invite to the very last CGS seminar of the calendar year, because there's a whole schedule of other presentations for next semester, the wonderful Dr. Mira Hussein, who is currently a research fellow both in the Center for Middle East Studies and in Social and Political Sciences at University of Edinburgh, and whose previous presentations and publications are fantastic, and I'm really looking forward to this. And she's also got a formidable social media presence. Um, does very good analysis on social media. She doesn't do shit posting. Um, the format is that Mira will begin by talking about how she came to her subject and her scholarship, sort of give us a sense of her own sort of development of the ideas, and a kind of a personal trajectory that has led her to her research. Then she'll talk until about 6, and then we'll stop the recording and open the floor to questions. I'm very much looking forward to your presentation, dear Mira. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Khalili. I'm going to share a PowerPoint if that's okay.
Yes, please.
All right. How do I do this?
You click on the little, if you look at the bottom next to yeah, there you go.
Thank you. Not very
Sure.
tech savvy. It's age related. Hello, everyone. Just to introduce myself, my name is Mira Hussein. I'm from Dubai. I'm an associate fellow at the Al Walid Center for the Study of Islam in the Contemporary World at the University of Edinburgh. I'm also a visiting fellow at the School of Social and Political Science here at the University of Edinburgh as well. Before I proceed with an introductory note about my research trajectory and how this work I'm presenting today has come about, I want to preface with a necessary statement of solidarity. We are living in extraordinary times where multiple genocides are unfolding in various locations, in which profitable global arms industry is testing its machineries of death on Black and brown bodies. We mustn't normalize this violence through business as usual practices that compartmentalize otherwise disruptive events. These genocides should have brought the entire world to a halt. But as we are forced to labor in times of genocide, I feel the need to provoke discomfort by reminding myself and others that the Israeli genocide in Gaza is not a minor event that can be glossed over with interfaith dialogues or conferences on reconciliation. The extractive capitalist interests of the United Arab Emirates are wreaking havoc in Sudan, and ending financial support to the criminal warring parties will not bring back the lives of the hundreds of thousands of Sudanese who have died. While I do not care for the settler colonial state of Israel, I do love and care deeply about the United Arab Emirates and its good people. And for that reason, I continue to adhere strictly to the BDS guidelines on both. I also want to postscript the statement of solidarity by acknowledging the renewed wave of political denaturalizations that is sweeping the Arab states of the Gulf, with Kuwait barely making headlines for revoking the nationality of over 80,000 citizens, the latest of which is Dr. Tariq Suwaidan. The mass disenfranchisement of people is meant to impair their political agency and to stunt society as a whole and reconfigure the relationship between the state and its people to one of subjecthood rather than citizenship. Naturalization and denaturalization are therefore co-constitutive and should be understood as intentional parallel processes that run in the background of Gulf states' post-oil transformation projects. Now, there's a plethora of academic literature on exclusionary citizenship in the Gulf and how it affects various communities, such as the Bedouin, the children of female citizens, hello, and long-term residents in the UAE and the wider Gulf. They are either denied access to this certification of belonging, this assurance of permanence, or hope is simply dangled that citizenship might become attainable sometime in the abstract future. What is missing in this literature are examples of those who have been naturalized over the past 5 decades since Gulf states have come into formal being. In every Gulf state, there are notable figures and recognizable names of individuals or families that have been naturalized, often due to their contributions in the early years of state building. I can think of the example of Zaki Nusayba in the UAE, who now serves as the chancellor of UAE University. He is of Palestinian descent. Dr. Shafiq al-Ghabra, the late Shafiq al-Ghabra in Kuwait, also of Palestinian descent. The former late Lebanese premier, Rafiq al-Hariri, who was naturalized in Saudi in 1978, actually, and went on to become the prime minister to serve as a prime minister of Lebanon twice. Owing to these examples being far, few, and most importantly, public, they never translated into a pattern that would warrant any scrutiny or trigger societal angst. Recently, however, naturalization became a political tool, first instrumentalized by the Bahraini government in the early 2000s when it was used to engineer a demographic change that was intended to disadvantage the Shia population of the country by granting citizenship to many foreigners, Arabs and non-Arabs of Sunni backgrounds. Importantly, these naturalized citizens were either employed or integrated by the Ministry of Defense, which meant that their naturalization was perceived negatively due to its association with the institution of state violence. I borrow the phrase political naturalization or التجنيس السياسي from Bahraini scholar Professor Abdelhadi Khalaf, who wrote extensively about this policy of naturalization and denaturalization in the context of Bahrain. I urge you to look at his work. This policy migrated to the United Arab Emirates, especially in the period following the Arab uprisings. But it wasn't the naturalization of foreign citizens that piqued my interest in this topic. It was the elevation of subaltern groups that became noticeable at first, specifically Emirati citizens of different ethnic and non-tribal backgrounds. My presentation is based on a forthcoming article in which I trace this recent development in the UAE to geopolitical changes in the region, particularly in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings, which had rattled Gulf governments, including those that did not really experience any massive civil mobilizations. But I also think this instrumentalization of citizenship holds relevance beyond the Gulf region. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Trump administration in the US, for instance, is entertaining conversations on denaturalizing citizens and deporting legal residents and green card holders at a time of heightened engagement with the Gulf, not just militarily or economically, but on a new level of authoritarian exchange. There's another dark matter that is being exported by the Gulf region, and it's not oil. It is the appeal of unchecked power that generates an affluent panopticon, which one would be excused to think of as merely a concrete shopping mall. When a Labour government in the UK speaks of changes to its immigration policies, it draws on the logic of permanent and renewable guesthood, first applied in its former colonies. Now, that is not to say that the kafala system, as Umar al-Shihabi argues, is indigenous to the Gulf. It is far from it. It is very much a system introduced by the British during the Mandate period. Tested and refined in the colonies, they now appear to be ready for re-importation into the UK, despite the fact that this system has long been criticized for restricting and violating international human rights norms. I will use the former colonies as a point of departure. This is a map of tribes in the UAE, which was formerly known as the Trucial States of Oman. One feature of this map is that it inscribes a narrative of indigeneity that erases non-Arab and non-tribal histories in the region, implicitly weaving this timeline feature to explain why, despite being circumscribed, citizenship was conferred to individuals and families that were not subsumed under these quote-unquote original tribes. This exclusivity has historically been framed within the paradigm of rentier tribalism, a concept that works or implies that Emirati society is a static tribal entity sustained by the distribution of oil wealth and the preservation of traditional hierarchies. This narrative obscures the dynamic and evolving nature of Emirati society, particularly in relation to citizenship, belonging, and the social contract. Now, the scholarly consensus on the social contract of Gulf monarchies suggests that political stability and prosperity rely on the distribution of oil rents to citizens and presents the system as a natural iteration of a tribal system based on the distribution of bounties as a form of neo-patrimonialism. But this narrative, I think, falls into two conceptual pitfalls. The first is the tendency to anchor the social contract exclusively in the advent of oil, treating it as an exceptional phenomena that emerged solely from the process of state formation. The second, I think, is the inclination to attribute the social contract to pre-oil tribal structures, often portrayed as having been merely adapted or reconfigured in the post-oil era. While these perspectives offer interesting insights and very useful insights, they risk oversimplifying the complexities of state-society relations in the region. In pre-oil Gulf societies, as we all know, tribal leaders forged extractive alliances that enabled them to accrue revenue through the imposition of taxes. These irregular taxes applied not only to members of within loose tribal alliances, but also to non-tribal inhabitants of the same region or area who were permitted to engage in commercial activities. In the port city-states of Dubai, Kuwait, and Manama, tribal leaders competed to attract merchants to increase the volume of trade passing through their towns, which obviously through which taxes came in, by lowering tariffs, which of course resulted in their increased reliance and dependence on a multi-ethnic class of merchants. Within this framework, politics was conducted through a dynamic of power balancing and power sharing that were neither static nor uncontested. Any attempt to renege on the existing power balancing and resource sharing structures would then elicit a reaction that could undermine these alliances, upon which economic foundations and activities and money generating and income generating activities were predicated. Then, of course, came the British, and with them a system of identification along with passports. The arrival of the British fundamentally reconfigured state-society relations by introducing an external dependency that disrupted this delicate power balancing relationship between tribal leaders and their tax-paying co-inhabitants. I say co-inhabitants, not constituents. I think the perception, the understanding of this relationship changed with time. According to Emirati scholar Mohammed Ghabash, it was a compounded shift marked by the formalization of borders and the emergence of oil, which enabled rulers to consolidate their authority and circumvent this reciprocal obligations that had previously underpinned local modes of governance. This transformation laid the groundwork for the modern social contract in the UAE, which would later be renegotiated as a response to geopolitical and economic changes, and I will come back to this point later. Emirati economist Professor Yusuf al-Yusuf challenges the characterization of the UAE's governance model as tribal. He argues that this label misrepresents the historical and social modes of tribal governance in the Arabian Peninsula. He says that tribal systems that existed prior to the arrival of the British operated on an egalitarian basis in which leaders were regarded as first among equals, and governance depended on reciprocal relationships and collective decision-making. However, the arrival of the British disrupted this framework as their external support for the ruling families undermined traditional power balancing dynamics. Al-Yusuf goes on to say that the current ruling systems across the Gulf are better understood as single-family systems, in which ruling families exist as a distinct and isolated caste or class, separate from the societies they govern. I put together this diagram to conceptualize the rentier hierarchy that I argue existed prior to the transformations ushered by the Arab uprisings. This diagram is more or less accepted, I guess, in the academic community and official narrative as representative of the social order in the country. So over the past few days, I've actually spent so much time with Emirati academics discussing this image. Um, Although we agreed that it is deficient and does not capture the historical shifts, it is adequate for purpose. So I'm going to go along with this for now. I say deficient because the Benias Confederation, for instance, has changed over time and included interior tribes that were not initially part of this confederation. We also contemplated whether a random white man just simply decided to give a name to something spontaneous, like maybe there wasn't really a confederation or an alliance as such. For the sake of consistency, I'll use this breakdown to explain how society is conceived in the UAE. A point that does not translate through text is the fact that all these hierarchies, with no exception, are multi-ethnic. The degree to which they are differs, such that the diversity increases as we move downward. So ethnic diversity is not a new feature in the composition of UAE society. What is new is the cultural diversity, and I will come back to this also at a later point. The diagram shows relationships of reciprocity. They're not transactional, not yet, but reciprocal, based on egalitarian tenets, which one could say were remnants of or from pre-oil times. The ruling elites derived their legitimacy from the tribal base and needed the continued cooperation and investments of the merchant class and the manpower of citizens, the majority of whom lived in the less affluent emirates of the north. In return, the tribal base benefited greatly from the government's generous distributive schemes that favored this stratum with positions in public office and key ministries, positions that were often rotating within the same tribe, sometimes even within the same family. In addition to large lands, farmlands, which are considered very expensive and costly because they're water intensive and so forth, and other largesse. Now, this is not a static order, which is very important because social mobility was possible, and many people moved upwards, even from the very bottom. We see an acceleration of this with the advent of oil and the proliferation of higher education, but also the kafala system, which enabled private citizens to accumulate wealth. Important caveats: social mobility was not equal across all emirates. Some emirates, like Dubai, had more such opportunities than, say, Sharjah. In fact, Abu Dhabi and Dubai allowed for citizens of other emirates to experience this social mobility through jobs. They opened up jobs to citizens of other emirates. That said, for a long time, Abu Dhabi retained its tribal character, which meant that it was uncommon to see someone of a non-tribal background in a visible position of power in Abu Dhabi. This was not the case in Dubai, which historically has always been a cosmopolitan city. Even then, I recall as a young woman in my early undergrad years, I remember kind of discussing with my parents what I wanted to do in university and my plans for the future. And I remember my mom saying, "You are Imiya, you are Ajam. There's a ceiling for how far you can go, how high up you can aim." Now, the statement really contradicted her own lived experience and the status of her family. I thought, did she think that there was a plug placed somewhere to constrict the mobility of Ajam so that they would no longer experience or enjoy the same benefits they did in pre-oil times? My personal impression was that as the country was beginning to experiment with curating a national identity, especially in the period following the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the non-Arab and non-tribal communities in the UAE really felt that shift, to the extent that many families started adopting tribal names in order to assimilate into Arabness. In fact, I remember, for instance, people would come and say, "Oh, so and so from that tribe, said such and such." And the common retort at the time was, "What Shamsi, what Mheri, what insert popular or very well-known family name. This person, we know their father. Their father is from Qashm Island, and he used to sell dengo, boiled chickpeas by the creek." So this kind of rhetoric was very common when I was growing up. I don't hear it anymore. I don't know if people are changing, attitudes are changing. I don't have an explanation for this, but at the time, people would kind of make fun and ridicule those who try to change their heritage and assume, fake heritage or whatever. Um, At the same time, the ruling elites, thanks to this encounter with the British, began to perceive themselves differently and gradually evolved out of the more egalitarian tribal order into a distinct class in the image of Western monarchies or royalties. Now, Professor Al-Yusuf alludes to this in his book, but stops at describing this transformation as a single family system. I'm here stretching this concept further to argue that instead of being just rulers, the ruling elites began to conceive of themselves, or at least aspire to become royals. And you can see this in the diagram. I've detached the tip, so it doesn't even sit on top of this hierarchy. It's separate, external to it. This new social hierarchy that emerged after the discovery of oil created an independent ruling class in ways that configured power dynamics, while also necessitating the construction of a national identity. Something that the other newly independent Gulf states were also embarking on. National identity, I argue, was a project to maintain a separation between the ruling class and their constituents, and it was also a means by which the ruling elites could craft a narrative of asala, or authenticity, positioning themselves as both the symbols and embodiments of it. I don't want to take up time to talk about the construction of national identity in relation to the social order. I kind of cover in the paper. Instead, I will reference the work of Qatari scholar Maryam al-Kuwari, who discussed the gradual erosion of tribal asabiyya or group solidarity that was supplanted with a unifying national identity, which marked the first significant disruption to the primacy of the tribe. Not to say that it led to the complete erosion or decline of tribal influence, it instead created a supra-identity that is decoupled from tribe and lineage, and it sort of challenged social hierarchies, mainly within official discourse, as states across the Gulf went on to present national belonging as inclusive and transcending ethnic and tribal divisions. You can see there's this construction of, a very black and white, through black and white imagery, the construction of this, heritage that extends through time immemorial, and even with the use of more recent pictures that feature oil wells in the background, you still see that there's some continuity here. It's still Arab, it's still dunes and camels and so forth. The early 2000s witnessed a heavy state-led investment in the project of national identity. We're talking national hymns, a digital national identity. In fact, 2008 was labeled the Year of National Identity in the UAE, beginning a tradition of theming each year. Now, all was well and dandy until the Arab uprisings that gathered stomping force in other Arab states, with its dust rising across the Gulf. The Arab uprisings of 2011 marked a turning point for the UAE. The government's first instinct was to inject financial incentives and increase handouts to preempt any potential unrest. In the UAE, no large-scale mobilizations materialized, nothing like what was experienced in Bahrain, parts of Saudi, or even Oman. What did happen, however, was that a group of academics, legal practitioners, and social activists representing both latent liberal and Islamic currents in the country signed what Gwen Okralik describes as a polite petition, calling for incremental political reforms. The petition was submitted privately to the president. And when there was no response, some of the signatories decided to publicize it, perhaps to embarrass the government or prod them into responding. This was perceived by the government as an audacious transgression that intended to challenge or undermine the authority and prestige of the government. As a result, the government responded with severe reprisals, signaling its unwillingness to negotiate or renegotiate the ruling bargain. This moment of political participation culminated in the UAE's first mass trial in 2013, where 94 citizens were charged with sedition and alleged ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. Among those indicted were members of influential tribes, high-ranking government officials, and leading intellectuals. Individuals who, under previous iterations of the social contract, might have been shielded by their place within the established hierarchies, by their tribe names, by their affiliations and network. Yet for the first time, neither tribal affiliation nor social eminence and standing protected them against the state's repressive response. This caused a rupture in the traditional ruling bargain, as the UAE's leadership prioritized regime security over the conventional tribal mechanisms of mediation and negotiation. Soon after, the state adopted a new articulation of national identity that no longer centered tribal lineage or birthright through patrilineal descent as the primary markers of belonging. Instead, a more cosmopolitan national identity took shape, marked by the gradual rise of a new elite class, a new inner circle. This new class comprises Emiratis of diverse ethnic backgrounds, along with newly naturalized citizens who now form the inner circles of the ruling elites. In this evolution, Abu Dhabi's identity politics began to resemble Dubai's more inclusive approach, signaling a profound transformation in how Emirati national identity is constructed and mobilized to uphold regime stability and authority. These emerging power networks were not merely defined by their in-demand skills. They were very entrepreneurial about their skills, their education, their worldliness, their openness, and basically they were very entrepreneurial in the way they marketed themselves as well. Their critical political function within the state's evolving governance model was key. Crucially, their lack of a tribal safety net made them more expendable in the unlikely event of dissent, and therefore more attractive. And any punitive measure against them would neither elicit collective retaliation nor risk further destabilizing the state's residual tribal support structures. As such, the emergence of a non-tribal elite served a dual purpose. First, it aligned with the UAE's post-Arab uprisings governance strategy, while also providing the regime with an additional layer of political insulation, allowing it to enforce discipline within its upper ranks without triggering disruptions in tribal patronage networks. This shift in elite composition, I argue, also redefined the foundation of political loyalty, replacing the historical framework of tribal allegiance with a system rooted in cultivated indebtedness. So gratitude is now what sort of defines this relationship. Unlike tribal elites, whose loyalty was maintained through reciprocal patronage networks and mutual obligations, the new non-tribal elite owe their political ascension entirely to the state. Their access to power was not an inherited entitlement, but a conditional privilege requiring continuous demonstration of allegiance. The incorporation of non-tribal citizens into elite positions established a new stratum of indebted functionaries within the UAE's governance system. But this development went further with the inclusion of an even more precarious and therefore more dependent category, newly naturalized citizens. I have a diagram for this, a different diagram. Positioned at the margins of the restructured social contract, naturalized citizens occupy a distinct space that unsettles conventional notions of citizenship in its Emirati iteration. Whereas tribal and non-tribal Emirati citizens are historically and culturally embedded in their political and economic roles within the domestic social hierarchy, the newly naturalized class of citizens are mobilized for purposes that reach beyond the territorial boundaries of the state. I'm just going to quickly explain that the first class or caste consists now not only of powerful tribes, but also of members of the merchant class, either as collective families or individuals. So there was a fusion between these classes. There's some sort of movement that happened there. They're fused into each other, and non-citizens were included in this new kind of view or perception of how society is organized. Now, non-citizens lend also some sort of legitimacy, as Christopher Davidson argues, to the ruling elites. What is expected of them is acquiescence. In return, they get a promise or the hope of permanence. This was beneficial, especially to Arab non-citizens who came from countries that were affected by destabilizations or repressive overtakes after the Arab uprisings. In 2021, the UAE announced legal amendments to allow the government to grant UAE citizenship to investors, specialized talents, and professionals, including scientists, doctors, engineers, artists, authors, and their families, through a process of nominations exclusive to the rulers. Naturalization became a means to acquire a new cadre of talented citizens whose inclusion would bolster the UAE's international rankings across different sectors, drive local innovation, and cultivate a generative sense of investment in the nation's future. We have this policy of Emiratization where they try to kind of encourage the private sector to include Emiratis and hire Emiratis and retain them. But I think what happened was sort of a shift. Instead of Emiratizing or nationalizing a job, you nationalize the person, you emiratize the person who holds the position. But actually, this nomination process by which different rulers can nominate someone for citizenship did exist in the past. It was halted for a while or slowed down, I suppose. But then who gets to nominate citizens today? I don't think it's across different emirates. I think it really is very much centralized. But I'm just repeating what it says here in Sheikh Mohammed Barash's post. A likely catalyst for the use of naturalization as an incentivizing pull mechanism was the COVID-19 pandemic as well, which triggered an economic downturn and an exodus among foreign workers amid widespread job losses. This crisis necessitated a rethinking of the social contract that had long kept foreign talent perpetually transient. Rather than grounding national belonging in territorial attachment, long-term contribution, or residency, the UAE's new model of political naturalization operates as a strategic instrument for influence projection beyond its domestic utility as well. And this is where my whole thesis about political naturalization comes. It functions as a means of extending the state's ideological and economic reach abroad by embedding loyal, state-aligned actors within foreign jurisdictions. These naturalized individuals serve as human capital, whose value lies less in their integration into domestic society, but rather in their capacity to advance Emirati interests across multiple arenas of transnational engagement. Interestingly, these individuals, the newly naturalized citizens, are permitted to retain a power balancing tool in the form of original citizenship. I don't know if I can go back. I think I can go back. So here it says they can retain. I think here it says they can retain their other nationality. A privilege that has been withdrawn from the tribes and the merchant classes and the ordinary citizens through the formation of the nation state and the institution of borders. So in the past, if a tribe falls out with the ruling elites, they would just pack and move to another emirate or kind of form an alliance with another tribe. This mobility was really constricted by borders, but also by the fact that you can't move. And we've seen how this kind of panned out in Qatar's elections, when the part of the group or members of the Al-Meri tribe were really not allowed to participate in the elections because they were not really integrated. They were too mobile, if you will. Because political naturalization in the UAE is discrete, it facilitates a highly mission-specific and often temporary incorporation of this human capital. The result is the creation of a class of transit citizens whose allegiance is contractual rather than communal, and whose affiliation can be severed without the risk of destabilizing the domestic political order. To illustrate my argument, I use two prominent figures as case studies. The first is Abdallah bin Bayya. Bin Bayya is a Mauritanian scholar of considerable renown, better known as the ideological rival to the late Yusuf al-Qaradawi. Bin Bayya first became acquainted with the UAE in the late 1970s during his tenure as a minister in his own country. and remained connected to the Mauritanian Sufi orders that took up residence in Al Ain. But bin Baya's formal involvement with the UAE government deepened in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings, when his advocacy for anti-revolutionary jurisprudence and emphasis on political stability closely aligned with the UAE's outlook. His ideological breakup, if you will, with Yusuf al-Qaradawi made him an ideal candidate to front the PR against the latter's revolutionary jurisprudence. Religion was never at the forefront of UAE's soft power, nor did it necessarily vie to compete in that field with Saudi Arabia, Egypt, or even Iran. But the fallout between bin Baya and Qaradawi presented a great opportunity for the UAE to develop a homegrown religious project for export and local consumption as well. Abdullah bin Baya's jurisprudence of peace, fiqh al-salam, offered the UAE the religious vocabulary that emphasized political stability, obedience to the rulers, and the rejection of revolutionary movements, an outlook that matched the state's post-Arab uprisings priorities. Backed by strong state support, bin Baya built institutions like the Forum for Promoting Peace and the Council of Muslim Elders in the hope to position the UAE as a global voice of religious moderation. But when this project failed to gain the broad legitimacy the UAE hoped for, the state pivoted towards a more locally oriented project to manage its own social transformation. I argue that the state drew on bin Baya's earlier work on the fiqh al-aqaliyat, or the jurisprudence of Muslim minorities, originally designed for Muslims living in the West, and repurposed it to treat Emirati citizens as a kind of minority, which we are actually, needing special religious flexibility within a heavily expatriate society. Minoritizing Islam in the homeland would serve to legitimize unpopular social changes as well as foreign policy decisions by superimposing a different context on Emiratis to generate a governmentality of illiberal first worldism. This is me throwing in random words to sound smart, but I'm trying to say something that I can't kind of think about at the moment. Perhaps we can think about this together. What I'm trying to say is basically Emiratis are invited to adapt to secular modes of governance as they would if they were to live in and be accepted or treated like a first world country or a Western country. Bin Baya's deployment of fiqh al-waqi' on top of all this fiqh that he threw on us, which is the jurisprudence of reality, provided theological cover for sweeping social and legal reforms, from loosening personal status laws to aligning the weekend with global markets. These frameworks helped the UAE justify its rapid modernization, its normalization with Israel, and its broader bid to promote a state-managed moderate Islam. In this sense, bin Baya became a form of strategic, mission-specific religious capital, valuable and useful, but ultimately replaceable once the political goals of this partnership were met. There are other religious figures of less prominence who were granted citizenship in the UAE and mobilized against ideological and political adversaries, such as Wasim Youssef and the better-known Habib Ali al-Jifri, who I can talk about more later if anyone's curious, but basically making the point that this is sort of a project on its own. Another example I use is Pavel Durov, the Russian tech founder of Telegram. Now, unlike bin Baya, whose background provides cultural and religious proximity and therefore makes him easily digestible as someone you can grant citizenship to, Durov's appeal lies in his status as a high-value technologist whose platform, with nearly 1 billion global users, makes him a globally known brand like Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg. His move to Dubai in 2017 allowed the UAE to brand itself as a hub for advanced technology, AI, and data-driven governance. Even though the country imposes tight controls on information flow, Durov, who publicly champions privacy and free expression, appears well settled in the country. His presence helps soften the image of a heavily surveilled state by projecting a veneer of digital openness, especially in the UAE market, as the UAE markets itself to other global tech figures as a place where innovation can flourish with minimal regulatory friction. This appeal is not accidental. Scholars note, and these are Emirati scholars, but I'm not going to mention who, that the UAE wraps its surveillance infrastructure in the language of smart cities and curated modernity, offering high net worth individuals a form of differentiated residency, a lifestyle insulated from the intrusive oversight experienced by ordinary citizens and residents. For global elites like Durov, this special care includes exclusive living spaces, access to one of the world's strongest passports, and the political protection that came into sharp focus when the UAE intervened diplomatically during Durov's brief detention in France. In return, Durov's association with the UAE bolsters its global branding, helping position the country as both a sanctuary of mobile tech elites and a regulatory sandbox where technologies, including AI, can be tested locally beyond the oversight found in liberal democracies. This mutual benefit is further deepened by the UAE's financial involvement in Telegram, including major investments through Abu Dhabi-backed funds. Telegram gained increased relevance during the ongoing Israeli genocide in Gaza when it became one of the few spaces allowing uncensored pro-Palestine content, which slightly intensified political pressure on Durov from Western governments and led to his detention in France. Against this backdrop, the possibility of a transactional relationship becomes plausible. By hosting Telegram and holding financial and political leverage over its founder, the UAE may gain privileged access or influence over a platform it cannot openly control. This enables the state to showcase selective pockets of digital freedom, useful for attracting talent and investment, while retaining the power to retract that freedom, manipulate it whenever it clashes with political priorities. Another example is, of course, Changpeng Zhao, the founder of Binance, a cryptocurrency platform. Recently, he was pardoned by Trump because of his investment with Trump's own company, but also his crime, really. He was detained because of money laundering and supposedly allowing his platform to be used to fund Hamas. I guess everybody's Hamas now, to fund Hamas and to kind of funnel money to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Basically the same accusations they threw at Pavel Durov, that you facilitated information flow, financial flow, and so forth. He was pardoned, and I think we know why. Not only the investment, but his citizenship will have played a role, I believe, to get him to kind of wiggle him out of that fix that he got himself into. But there are other, in UAE today, citizenship isn't a fixed status. This is my main argument. It's something that the state uses strategically. It can take citizenship away when it wants to. It stopped doing so. It really did it once when it denaturalized 5 Emiratis following the signing of the petition. It never did it again. And I have a theory about that, but we can talk about it later. It can take citizenship away when it wants to, or grant it to people who bring something valuable to the country. In both cases I presented, Durov and Ben Baya, citizenship works less like a sign of national belonging and more like a deal. You help the state achieve something and it gives you a passport and a safe base. But there are other ways in which citizenship has been mobilized overseas. The story, for instance, on the left of Farhat Bingdara shows this even more clearly. Bingdara was a senior Libyan official under Gaddafi who spent more than 10 years living in Abu Dhabi, where he was granted Emirati citizenship at some point, unknown point. In 2022, he reappeared as the head of Libya's National Oil Corporation, widely seen as a move supported by the UAE. Under him, a controversial oil for fuel scheme involving the UAE-linked companies, many UAE-linked companies, grew rapidly. But when Libyan authorities got wind of that and started digging under him in 2024, he resigned overnight and quietly returned to the UAE. His Emirati passport allowed him to step into a powerful position when it suited the UAE, then slip out again when things went south. Put together, these cases show how the UAE uses citizenship as a flexible tool to build influence, protect its allies, and shape events both at home and across the region. A more recent controversy actually emerged over the summer in Sudan, when a 36-year UAE veteran was appointed Minister of Animal Resources and Fisheries in Sudan. An online campaign was unleashed critical of his appointment, suggesting that Ahmed Tijani al-Mansouri, who is credited for founding the UAE's successful dairy company Arawabi, holds UAE citizenship. Although al-Mansouri weathered the social media storm and assumed his role as minister, he denied holding UAE citizenship. Suspicions remain strong, especially considering the UAE's role in the Sudanese conflict and its interest in its various resources from gold to farmlands. I want to conclude by saying that the extended reach through the instrumentalization of citizenship is not only novel, but also impressive in a sinister way. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but yeah, it's impressive. For a geographically small country like the UAE, it certainly conducts itself as a sub-imperial power that can dictate new rules in the neoliberal project of an international order. Thank you. And I look forward to questions or critiques.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mira. It's an extraordinary presentation, and I'm incredibly impressed. At this point, I'm going to turn off the recording so that we could have a discussion. And I have a ton of questions, but I see that Abdulhadi Khalaf had actually his hand up, so we're going to go to him in a moment. Let me turn off the recording. Just 1 minute.